When the world says you are worthless, God says you are valuable. When the world says you are weak, God says you are strong. When the world says you are cursed, God says you are blessed. When the world says you are broken, God says you are whole. When the world says you are lost, God says you are found. When the world says you are insignificant, God says you are significant. When the world says you are a failure, God says you are victorious. When the world says you are hopeless, God says you have the seeds of hope blooming within you. When the world says you are unlovable, God says you are loved beyond measure. When the world says you are despised, God says you're the apple of his eye. When the world says you are unworthy, God says you are worthy of his love and grace. When the world says you are broken beyond repair, God says you are being beautifully restored. When the world says you are worthless, God says you are his precious treasure. When the world says you are condemned, God says you are redeemed. When the world says you are alone, God says he is always with you. When the world says you are rejected, God says you are chosen. When the world says you are abandoned, God says you are his beloved child. When the world says you are condemned, God says you are saved by his grace. When the world says you are forsaken, God says you are cherished. When the world says you are doomed, God says you are destined for greatness. When the world says you are a mess, God says you are going to be his message. When the world calls you ignorant, God reveals his wisdom within you. When the world sees your flaws, God sees the rough edges of a diamond in the making. When the world says you are a sinner and cannot be his bride, God says you are washed white with the blood of the Lamb, made perfect and pure, destined for an eternal union with him.